I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Greetings, and welcome back to the show. Appreciate your being here for Opus 253 of the TRILLOQUY podcast. Well, I got to talk about what's going on at the Kennedy Center in today's TRILLOQUY. At the end of the Opus, the right-wing takeover of American reality has officially touched the arts, and ideas on what to do about it are unfortunately all over the place. So more on that a little later. But for now, it's a celebration of an upcoming performance by the Discovery Orchestra. This Emmy-nominated Telly Award-winning New Jersey-based ensemble will present a special Black History Month concert on Sunday, February 23rd at Grace Episcopal Church over in Newark. It's a show celebrating not only Black history, but its intersection with the Latine experience. They've even titled the event Discover Angelitos Negros, or Little Black Angels. Among those featured on this program will be soprano Cheryl Warfield, who you can hear from in the next opus of the TRILLOQUY podcast, and Maestro George Marriner Maull will be featured as well, who I actually speak to today. George is a really fascinating person. He's worked as a professional musician, as a radio and television host, and even as an entrepreneur, putting together the Discovery Orchestra some years ago to create experiences just like the one coming up now on February 23rd. If there's anything that I hope that you pull from this dialogue is the potential impact of music education. It's one thing to talk about joining the band or joining the choir as a kid, but it's another thing to really consider how joining a school music program can pave the way for an incredibly diverse career within the arts. That's certainly the case for George. So huge thanks to him for taking the time to chat with me and to share a part of his story. To get us into our dialogue, I'd like to reference a piece of music that George speaks to during our interview. It's not the exact recording that he mentions. I couldn't quite find the exact recording, but this is the piece of music, so just wanted to highlight it here today. Gustavo Dudamel leads the Berlin Philharmonic here, delivering an excerpt from Antonin Dvorak's New World Symphony, his Symphony Number 9. Hope you enjoyed this refresher, a look back into the canon, and hope you enjoy my chat with Mr. George Marriner Maull.
Well, I definitely see public media as the way to reach the most people. Obviously, the way classical music has been set up, and really many aspects of performance in the world, for so many years, decades, centuries, was we're going to give this concert on this date at this time. If you come and be there, then you'll have it. If you don't, then you're not going to get it, and there's nothing we can do about that. And that, of course, restricts the playing field for so many people. I mean, when people talk about Europe being, perhaps the golden age of classical music, I mean, I don't think that many more people showed up at concert halls in Mozart's lifetime than do today. Mm. First of all, they don't hold that many people. So what were all the other people doing when Mozart was having a symphony performed or whatever? It's like they can't all be there. So media has given us a tool that we've never had before. And as we know, it can be used for both good and less good purposes.
You have me thinking about a question I've never asked myself. Of these historic European composers, who would have been the best TV or radio personality? That's something I'll have to think about. Well,
that's a good question.
And, we have this conversation because at the end of the day, we're talking about accessibility, making classical music accessible, something that you've long been dedicated to. I wonder what that looks like for you tactically. Is it a question of repertoire, marketing, where the concerts happen? How do you think about accessibility?
Well, of course, our live performances are few and far between at this point. When we began as the Discovery Orchestra in 2006, we were still giving, maybe 7, 8 different kinds of performances a year, some with orchestra, some with chamber ensembles, some in homes, some in concert halls. But as we began progressing in our planning for the future, it just seemed to dawn on the board and the staff and people who were adjunct people on our committees that we just couldn't reach as many people as we wanted to giving live performances. Mm-hmm. So we were going to have to dedicate ourselves to media performances in one way or another. And of course, one has been our television shows for American Public Television, and the other came about just totally accidentally when WWFM interviewed me one afternoon and then decided, hey, you should do a show on this station, So, that was just something that fell into our laps, obviously.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's great. And we will definitely talk a little bit more about the Discovery Orchestra here in a few minutes. But I wonder, to get us into talking about your background and your own personal experiences in music, how much of your desire and your goals behind the Discovery Orchestra are tied to your experiences? Was classical music very accessible for you or not accessible to you, and you utilize the Discovery Orchestra in a response to those things? I wonder if you can speak to that.
I can. I grew up in a classical music cradle. My mother was a very highly trained and wonderful classical pianist who was very sad and almost bitter about the fact that she was not able to turn that into a career. Mm-hmm. So she had, like so many people in her place, become the local piano teacher on our block by the time my brother and I arrived. But she still was performing and she still practiced every day. So there was all this, insane music going on. And she had friends who would come to the house. Members of the Philadelphia Lyric Opera would stop by and she would play arias for them. Or she had a violinist friend named Geno Donat, who was Hungarian. He had a string quartet and they would show up. And, so there would be a quintet being played, in the living room. It was a very 24/7 kind of classical music feeling in our house. Then my mother and my grandmother got the bright idea. We lived with my grandparents and my great aunt to send my brother and me to an Episcopal choir school for boys, much like St. Thomas in New York City on Fifth Avenue. Except this was not a live-in boarding situation. This was a day school. So all the kids came from various parts of Philadelphia to go to St. Peter's Choir School at 4th and Lombard. The church itself was on 3rd and Pine. They had this whole block, including their cemetery. I mean, it was just this sort of giant complex of this church, which had been built in 1762, I believe. But in any event, they had a choir school there modeled after the cathedral choir schools in England. And so my brother and I both were subjected to what almost felt, I guess, like being a professional musician from age 9 for a period of time. I was there for 4 years until I was 12, but that meant, first of all, in addition to the academic subjects, which were rigorous, I mean, they made us study Latin and French as little kids. Yeah, right. In addition to science and math and English and what have you, history, we had solfege classes, during the week. Every kid had to take piano lessons in the school. There were 45 of us in the school, grades 4 through 9, 45. So it was almost like being tutored. The class sizes were very small, but you also had to take public speaking classes. I mean, this you can see what's happening to George.
Right. That's incredible.
And then, of course, there were essentially 2 performances a week, 2 church services, morning and evening, from September through June every year. So it was a lot of repertoire. I mean, of course, we were singing everything that I guess the choir master wanted us to perform, which included Renaissance stuff. We sang Palestrina, we sang Vittoria, we
Sure.
sang Brahms, we sang Rachmaninoff, we sang, all the British Victorian composers. But the point is that it felt like being a professional musician, although I didn't know that's what it would feel like.
Sure.
I mean, I had nothing to compare it to. This was my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I noticed while I was at the choir school was that when we were singing in church, not everyone was paying attention.
Good eye.
When I was counting rests, I would sometimes furtively glance around the congregation, and I would see some people were like reading the church bulletin, of course, some people were asleep. And so, some of the clergy looked bored out of their minds.
Mm.
And there were other people, though, who looked to be hanging on every sound that came out of our mouths and out of the organ. And I began to ponder that. I just thought, what? Because I had my first self-aware being moved to tears experience with classical music when I was 4.5. It's a seminal moment in my life. My mother had purchased a recording of the New World Symphony with the Vienna Symphony Orchestra conducted by Hans Swarovski, who is not known to most people at all. He mostly had a career in Europe, but in any event, that record arrived and was put on our Gimbel Brothers monophonic record player, portable record player, which of course had one of the worst sound reproductions in the world.
Okay.
I mean, having a symphony orchestra played through one monophonic little speaker is not the ideal, obviously, but it shook me to my core. I had never encountered, it was the first time I listened to a symphony orchestra. First time, just sitting on the floor in our living room. And I look at my life as before Dvorak and after Dvorak. Before that moment and after that moment, because my reaction and my attention to music was never the same. And that's why I was so curious about the people who were not listening at St. Peter's Church. Why didn't they have the same reaction to this stuff that I seemed to have? But anyway, I tucked that away and went off to public school in 8th grade. My local public school, which in those days in Philadelphia, every public school had several bands, choirs, orchestras. They had instruments to lend to kids. I mean, it was an amazing time in the early 60s in Philadelphia. But I met a teacher there who would become the most profound influence in my life. This is a guy named Saul Feinberg. And he was, quote unquote, the general music teacher at Lincoln High School, which meant that all the kids who weren't in the band choirs or the orchestras, and of course I was drafted into the choir immediately. Obviously, here's a well-trained kid who can sight sing, for heaven's sake, get him in the choir,
Of course, yeah.
But Saul was responsible for teaching all the other kids, because in that time, in 8th and 9th grade, every kid in the Philadelphia school system was obviously the Pennsylvania curriculum was required to take 2 years of what was called general music.
2 years, wow.
2 years, 2 periods a week, 8th and 9th grade, 2 periods a week for those 2 years of your school life. Saul took that requirement and turned it into what he called his perceptive listening class.
Interesting.
Now, I was not required to take his class. I discovered it completely accidentally. I was sitting in the cafeteria during lunch period. The music wing was off to the side of that, separated from other parts of the building so that the noise that we make as musicians didn't interfere with algebra class or whatever, So I heard coming down the corridor the strains of the New World Symphony, the piece that had turned my life upside down.
Right.
So I dropped my lunch and headed toward this room. And I sat down on the floor outside the classroom. And several things occurred to me. One was there was no external noise in this class. There was only the sound of the music. And knowing my neighborhood, I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Philadelphia. Very few kids like classical music. I would be taunted, for having gone to the choir school. So, here these kids obviously were sitting quiet as mice. And I thought, has he bound and gagged them? What has he done to these kids? Why are they so quiet? Well, aside from the fact that he didn't take any crap from kids, he was a brilliant teacher, brilliant. And he happened to come out of the room while the music was on and said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I heard the music down the hallway." And he said, "Well, you might be more comfortable sitting in a chair." So I began to audit his classes during my lunch periods.
That's incredible.
And here I was finding out for the first time musical phenomena that I knew, let's say an ascending sequence, but I didn't know what it was called. And I had no way of describing it to anybody else, but I had been moved by sequences emotionally. So anyway, what he was doing was he was teaching these kids how to notice as much as possible about the elements of music in a given piece of music. And it was short. He would only work on like one movement of something at a time. And he had it planned out so that by the end of the year, you would have covered X amount of literature. But he never, ever said anything like, "This is great music. You should appreciate this." Absolutely out of the question. He was always challenging them to answer questions, to solve problems, such as, okay, he might say, "All you kids, I want you to raise your hands when the trombones come in this next passage that we're going to play." Then he would play a piece of music that the trombones didn't play in. And of course, so the kids would get consternation going here. But, and he said, "I did that on purpose to see if you were really paying attention."
Sure.
This is a tool that I've used in all of my Discovery concerts since I started giving them. Something I learned from Saul. But the point is, then, he would say, "Okay, count the number of steps in this descending sequence. How many stair steps does it have?" Or, who else is playing with the violins there? Can you tell? It was filling in blanks. He also made use of a device that he called a listening guide. And what he would do is he would create this thing in which numbered musical events, 1 through however many he made up for the movement, 12, 20, whatever it was, certain things would happen. Like at number 7, there was a big crescendo, and he would just have a picture of the crescendo symbol, but they would have to understand what was happening there to the music, or suddenly soft or anything like that. He's just making them aware of the dynamics, of the harmony, of the melodies, of the texture, of the form, by having them solve the problem. Oh, by listening to the next excerpt he played for them. It was remarkable. So anyway, he ultimately became my piano teacher. And so we developed a much closer relationship because I had issues as a teenager. My dad, one of the most loving people you'd ever want to meet, had almost no education. His father had died just before the Great Depression began to deepen. He had to quit school, I guess, at 7th grade, and he became a manual laborer. And, so he really did not have a great vision, a great wide vision of the world. It was very parochial. In fact, he was, not only was he prejudiced against people who looked different than him or spoke differently than him, he was already afraid of the Great Replacement. Because as a manual laborer, even during the 1950s, I remember he was afraid that somehow Black men were going to take his job away from him.
Wow.
Way back then.
Yeah.
Yes. And so he had this issue, with people of color. And of course, after World War II, he had issues with anyone who looked Asian. They were also kind of an enemy, even if they were Chinese or Korean. He made no difference. It was sort of like all those people were suspicious somehow. Anyway, so it was, I would say my household was very typical of my neighborhood. Most of the people there were of European or British background. And so they had, and my grandmother, my heavens, who was British, she didn't like anybody who wasn't British. So, for instance, when we'd be sitting on the porch, my grandmother would say to me as this little boy walked by, you must not play with him. And I realized it was Bobby Stakowicz, this Polish kid who lived next door. I was already one of his best friends. And she's telling me, she said, he's Polish, And of course, it was typical. There was a lot of prejudice floating around, and of course, I didn't quite understand it. And especially when I got to public school, because there were people of every imaginable ethnicity in my local public school.
Certainly in Philadelphia.
And yeah, exactly. And so I began to realize there's something wrong with the approach in my house. So anyway, I became a rebellious teenager, which is why it was so important to have someone with as so much vision and openness as Saul Feinberg had. My mother didn't like Jewish people. My father did, because a Jewish family had provided my father's family with food during the Depression. They owned a drugstore down the street, and my grandmother was their maid. And so they just took care of my dad's family. So Jewish people were fine. It was a real mixed bag of thoughts floating around the Maull house there. But in any event, people like Saul, and of course, my best friend in high school turned out to be Jewish. And so, and they disabused me, that family. They were a wonderful family. Both parents had degrees from Columbia University. They disabused me of so much of the insane beliefs that I had been brought up to believe about other people, about the world around me. So between them and Saul, it's like they used a can opener on my brain or something. And I just couldn't look at the world the same way, which caused friction between me and my family members.
Sure. I mean, you're beautifully highlighting so many things. I mean, the power of access to the arts in school, the ways in which arts can really expand out into other aspects of your life, in the way that you're describing the impact that Saul had on you, even non-musically. It makes me think, I can't help but to ask you, with this not only proximity to, so much prejudice and hate, next to, your, broadening your perspective thanks to these folks, I wonder how you took that into classical music. I mean, you came up in a household where people maybe who look like me would not have been welcome in classical music. Even today in 2025, we're continuing to struggle to make sure that people that look like me are in the orchestra, in the audience. I wonder how you thought about those two things next to each other.
Well, it just sat in there and percolated for many years. And of course, as your experience tells you, and mine tells me, when I got to music school, there still were not very many people of color. In fact, when I went to the University of Louisville School of Music, there weren't even very many Asian students in the music school there, or members of the orchestra. I mean, the Louisville Orchestra looked like the Philadelphia Orchestra, mostly middle-aged white men. But, of course, they happened to engage a Hispanic conductor who was Hungarian in his real roots. That's Jorge Mester, who grew up in Mexico. But that was because his parents had fled the Nazis, from Hungary.
Sure.
And George, brought an interesting flavor to the Louisville Orchestra. He had us play music by people like Revueltas, and I'm sure the Louisville Orchestra had never played any music by any Hispanic composers before, So it was interesting. But, we didn't play anything by George Walker that I recall. It was a real eye-opener for me in the last 15, 20 years to find out about all these composers that I had never, ever engaged or heard of.
When you mentioned Silvestri Revueltas, it's interesting. What comes to mind to me first is the fact that he is a composer that was only first exposed to through my work in public media, like to 10 years as an orchestral musician. And now, I have access to so many things based on going through CDs and catalogs and records
Right.
and those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's incredible. How well I don't really believe that musicians with malice aforethought, said, well, we're not going to play any of those composers' music. I just think like the rest of our society, rest of white society, they just weren't aware of it.
Sure.
They just weren't aware that there were these other composers.
Yep. Yep.
And very fine composers, yes.
And that awareness goes in many different directions, because there are many people of color today who still have really no concept of people that look like them, not only playing orchestral music, but writing it. And not just last week or last year, for hundreds of years, it's been a part of the tradition.
Right. I mean, it's not on their radar. And so that's actually one of the things that at the Discovery Orchestra we take on a bit, because we feel like, well, we'll get to that. I do want to talk about it. But the thing was that I carried this more open-ended attitude toward people and life that Saul had bequeathed to me, and my best friend, Eric Michaels, had bequeathed to me. And it ultimately caused me to need to leave my house. My mother died of cancer she was contracted it when I was 17. She died when I was 18 of cancer. And she was the closest person to me in my family because, of course, she had a passionate love for classical music. She did not want me to go into music. Really, the main reason my grandmother and mother sent my brother and me to the choir school was because they had a very high batting average of turning out Episcopal clergymen.
Oh, so that was the goal.
And that was my grandmother's wish for us, yes, that we would both become Episcopal clergy. And my brother actually tried to go the whole 9 yards. He got to the point where he went to seminary and he went to an Episcopal college and he had a parish and then became an atheist and left the church.
It happens.
but he gave it a college try. He really did. I, on the other hand, when I was at the choir school, was the first time that I began to dream of being the conductor of an orchestra, of a symphony orchestra. But I didn't want to tell anybody because I had no idea how you could accomplish such a thing. I just, and when I eventually began studying the viola and told my teacher in the Philadelphia Orchestra that I wanted to be a conductor, his response was, "Are you out of your mind?"
Well, it did work out.
It did work out, but as you know very well, we have to somehow make it work out for ourselves in ways that might be slightly unorthodox. But in any event, as I said, it began to just stay in my mind that somehow most people don't actually listen to music. Now, you could certainly, if you asked any young person, this song that you love so much, they know every word of it. So they have obviously listened to it very carefully. But what Saul emphasized was that because of the invention of reproduced sound, I call it the Edison effect, because Edison devised a way to record sound, musical sound, which horrified John Philip Sousa when his friends told him that Edison had done this. Because, Sousa's response was, that will be the end of amateur music making. And while it took more than a century to happen, we got there. For most, during the 1800s and right up to World War II, there were mandolins and saxophones and clarinets and banjos in almost every house. Lots of houses had piano. People made music. My grandparents would sing together while my grandmother played the piano at night. But once recorded music became available electronically to everybody, making music became turning knobs or pushing buttons or whatever. In other words, that's how most people make music. They don't sing it themselves. They don't play it themselves.
Sure.
So the problem is that it's also ubiquitous. Everywhere you go, there is electronically reproduced music as a sonic wallpaper to every activity in your life. If you're at the supermarket, if you're at the dentist's office, wherever you go, there's a soundtrack playing in the background. This, Saul believed, trained generations of people in the industrialized world not to listen to music,
I see.
but to just hear it.
Wow. Wow. I never thought about it in quite that way, but that's a great point, actually.
And so therefore, the question is, if we're going to get the most out of a piece of music that we're not performing ourselves, that we're in the presence of, what's the way to do that? And obviously, it's to be completely present with the music, with all of your senses, especially your oral senses and your brain, taking in the information. So the idea to most people that you would actually have to listen to every second of a piece of music, whether it's a piece that Bach wrote or whether it's a piece that trying to think, Fats Waller wrote. It doesn't matter who wrote it. Those guys and women wrote them in such a way that they want you to pay attention from the first sound to the last. And if you ask someone, would you sit down for 5 minutes and give a piece of music your undivided attention? And say, well, why would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you rather be reading the newspaper or having a meal or a conversation while it plays in the background? And I'm not condemning music as background.
Sure.
We've had it as human beings from the beginning of our existence as human beings. There's always been background music for certain rituals and what have you, things that we did. But once composers began creating music that they were going to transmit very powerful feelings that they had, translate them into sound. Now we're talking about a different kind of an animal, and we have to listen to all of it. I mean, the fact that Brahms will play the same melody 3 minutes later in this piece of music with one change of chord, one chord difference. If you haven't listened at the beginning, you will not even have anything to make a comparison to. So you have to listen from the beginning. But then when you get to if you're not listening over here, you won't notice that one chord, which could be so emotionally powerful, it might bring a tear to your eyes, or it might give you 3 extra goosebumps when you're sitting there, just to notice that one harmonic shift. And of course, we know that Bach chorales are filled with those kinds of harmonic changes from one part of the chorale to the next when that phrase is repeated. And that's just one example. I mean, Saul said, you've got to be aware of all of the elements on that level, all of the elements. So I just carried this through my life and thought, what can I do? I don't know, when you were in Louisville, did everyone have a second job?
Many people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can't live on the Louisville Orchestra salary. At least we couldn't back in the 60s. So everybody had a job. And I finally got a job teaching at a private school. I was the only music teacher, grades kindergarten through 12. And I had not been a music education major. So I did crash courses with people from the university who taught music education in Kodai methods, in Orff methods, and anything I could get my hands on, to work with these kids. And of course, the older kids, I used Saul's methodology on them. I taught them how to listen. And again, I found the same situation. Most kids weren't listening. They just weren't listening. So it was a revelation to them to actually notice things in a piece of music. And of course, eventually some of them begin to get goosebumps from the process of listening. And that's the goal. So I only wanted to be a conductor for the longest time. And I made opportunities for myself such that I had 4 different posts by the time I left Louisville. I had become the conductor of the ballet. I was the assistant conductor at the opera company there, and got to do a subscription debut the last year we lived in Louisville. And I was I had a choral group, an amateur choral group. Anyway, the point is, I moved to New York City in 1975 that had nothing to conduct.
Mm-hmm.
So it was time to get out the viola and start beating the sidewalks and riding the subway,
Sure.
and doing anything I could to get viola work. And eventually, Eve Queller, I don't know if you know Eve or not. She's on the fringes of classical music in the sense that she started a thing called the Opera Orchestra of New York, which is now defunct. But she started it in the late 60s. And the whole deal was do unusual operatic repertoire, stuff that doesn't get done at the Met, that doesn't get done at New York City Opera, at Carnegie Hall with an orchestra and no costumes or sets, just stand up and sing it. And she would bring in the great opera stars. I mean, when I was playing for her, people like Montserrat Caballé would, be singing the lead roles. But then she would go to Europe and around the country listening to young singers, and she would find incredible singers to put in the smaller roles. Mm-hmm. And very often they would wind up at the Met in a few years because she had brought them to the stage of Carnegie Hall, singing just a minor little moment in one of these operas. But anyway, so Eve was a tremendous musician, and she asked me at a certain point to be her assistant conductor. So finally, some kind of a nail to hang my coat on here.
Right.
In the New York conducting scene. And for a while, she had me prepare the choruses, that was meaningful for me to do. And then I got an opportunity to study with a European conductor, an Austrian named Richard Johannes Lert, L-E-R-T. And Richard Johannes Lert was part of an incredible European tradition. I mean, his creds, he had played in the Berlin Philharmonic under Artur Nikisch, the most famous conductor at the turn of the previous century. He also had played under Richard Strauss and had worked under him as an assistant conductor. So his music creds were insane. I mean, his parents had been friends of Brahms. Brahms had been his godfather when he was a little kid. And so here he had moved to the United States, even though he had a good career going in Europe, because his wife wrote screenplays. So he moves to California so that she can work in the film industry and eventually becomes a conductor of the Pasadena Symphony. Well, at some point, the League of American Orchestras, an organization that I'm sure you know.
Oh, very well.
Yes, which in those days was called the American Symphony Orchestra League. But in any event, it had a lousy sounding acronym, ASOL. You can figure out how people said it. Sound like a treatment for hemorrhoids or something. But in any event, they found him. They found Dr. Laird and decided, here's a man who can bequeath an incredible amount of information to his young conducting students. So they would set him up in the mountains of Virginia, hidden away in the Shenandoah Valley, where no one would see these young conductors. And he insisted on that because he said they need to be able to make mistakes. And they would assemble an orchestra of players, professionals from all over the country who came there to play under him only for room and board because he was such a brilliant conductor. I mean, he had been trained so well by Strauss and Nikisch that he could do things on the podium. He was like a magician with a baton in his hand. He could do things that just astounded you, like in terms of creating rubato in a passage, just with his baton, without even talking about it to us. So in any event, there was an audition for this program, and Eve said, you should do this, George. You should audition to see if you can study with Richard Laird, or Richard Laird. And so the guinea pig orchestra on the East Coast was the New Jersey Symphony. So I auditioned over there in Newark for this summer program and was one of the 10 conductors selected from across the country to work with Richard Laird. It was a life-changing experience. I mean, he was the finest teacher of conducting I have ever had exposure to. And the thing was that from that, strangely enough, Tomasz Michalak, or Thomas Michalak, how people said it. He was the Polish music director of the New Jersey Symphony at that time. And he would have been one of the judges who saw me conduct the year before. And all of a sudden he calls me and says, George, would you come to Newark and have lunch? I might have some work for you. And I thought, oh. So I went over and had lunch, and I'm barely eating my soup. And he says, I'd like you to be my assistant conductor here at the New Jersey Symphony.
That's incredible.
And I almost dropped my spoon in my soup because he had only seen me conduct for about 10 minutes the year before, So anyway, he did engage me, and that was the beginning of my conducting life in this area of the world, which was very exciting. And even though they went on strike the next year for an entire season, and I went back to freelancing as a violist, I had managed to establish a number of conducting posts here for myself, in the vicinity.
Sure.
And so eventually I decided I wanted to have my own professional orchestra. And that's what began what was called the Philharmonic Orchestra of New Jersey. Now, I know that you wonder how and why anyone would start an orchestra of their own.
I mean, certainly from the paperwork to the business side of it, much less
the first requirement is that you are insane. That's you have to be out of your mind, as my viola teacher had said. And then you need really wonderful people to help you, friends who are willing to do it. And one of my best friends was a gentleman named Brian Dallow, who died sadly last year. Brian was teaching theory at Temple University, music theory. His wife was the music critic for a newspaper here in New Jersey called the Home News in New Brunswick. But she also wrote for the New York Times. She wrote for the Sunday Times in New Jersey. So she had a nice podium from which to influence people with her writings. So anyway, she had met me when I became assistant conductor of the New Jersey Symphony. In fact, she was the first person to interview me, which is how I met them. Well, the two of them really put in hours and hours and hours to help me start that orchestra called the Philharmonic Orchestra of New Jersey.
It takes a village to raise an orchestra.
Yes, right. And Brian, because he had lots of contacts, he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce in Plainfield, New Jersey. So he knew lawyers there, he knew bankers, he knew all sorts of people. And we managed to get this thing off the ground. We had one fundraiser in January of 1988 that made us enough profit to give our first concert in March of 1988. But doing the legal work, I mean, we could have never done that without lawyers volunteering their time to help us file the paperwork with the state of New Jersey so that we'd be a 501c3. I mean, you have to create that instrument so that people can give you money and take it off their taxes or whatever. But it's an insane process. I mean, I'm not sure I would recommend trying to start one's own orchestra to everyone, but if you can audition and get a job, that might be a better way to go.
And it was this Philharmonic. Is it this Philharmonic that became the Discovery Orchestra?
Precisely. And that's where the story gets interesting and all the pieces of my life get tied together. When we started the Philharmonic Orchestra of New Jersey, people began calling the office in several different types of ways. One was, I'm retired, and, my wife has been dragging me to symphony orchestra concerts for the last 20 years. I am bored out of my mind. Is there anything you could do for me? Then other people who were empty nesters would call and say, our kids are no longer at home. We're looking for something cultural to do. And we think we took a course in college in music appreciation, but we don't think we understand classical music. What can you? So long story short, I began giving a course in listening to music based on Saul Feinberg's to adults. Started out with 12 people. By 2002, I was seeing about 1,500 to 2,000 people a year in small groups, 12 to 500 at a time at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. So it developed in that regard. Then the board, in a planning session in the 90s, said, could you do in a concert what you do in that class that you give? And so our first Discovery concert was given at Princeton University in Richardson Auditorium, I think in 1996. And it wasn't long after that before, in another planning session, one of the board members said, could we turn that kind of concert into a public television show? And everybody in the room gasped, but they all wanted to do it. And so, by golly, we managed to do it in 2002. We created our first public television show on our own with, again, the help of lots of people, and then sent it to American Public Television to see if they would like to distribute it. And they said, we love it. Send us anything you got. And that began our relationship with APT, which was very exciting. Along the road to the forum, as things progressed, the board said, you know what? There are lots of symphony orchestras in the New York area. They're all the professional orchestras, the New Jersey Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, and all the visiting orchestras who come from all over the country and the world to perform there. Do we really need to be performing, no offense, George, with you conducting Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony? They're New York freelancers. They're 802 people. They play very well. It'll sound wonderful, but what's the best thing that we do? And they said, it's what you do with audiences, George. It's what you do in those Discovery concerts. So the board made a command decision in 2006 to stop giving regular concerts, only give Discovery concerts, and turn our name into the Discovery Orchestra, and our mission to teach the listening skills that help people deeply connect with classical music.
That's a beautiful, beautiful story. What a trajectory. Wow. So how does the upcoming concert, Black Angels, in your view, fit into this mission?
Yeah, well, it's an important one because the connection that made it happen was Patricio Molina. Patricio, of course, is a brilliant musician, 2 doctor's degrees, and composer, and his mind is amazing. And of course, he's from South America, so he has a very interesting ethnic background. I think his mother is actually from the Middle East, so he's got Hispanic and Middle Eastern genes floating around in him, and a wonderful vision for this, that again, most classical music lovers have never heard of these composers from the Caribbean, from South America, whatever, let alone African American, because they haven't heard of any of these people. So he, of course, began working with Cheryl Warfield earlier. I can't remember how they got together exactly, but at a certain point, he and Cheryl decided to create this program called Angelitos Negros, based on this wild Mexican movie in which a little girl asks her mother at one point, who is, I think the little girl's of mixed race, asks her mother, how come there are no paintings of Black angels? Angelitos Negros, why aren't they there? And that is part of the racial tension that is explored in that movie. And of course, Cheryl and Patricio said, hey, it's COVID. This is we got a problem. People don't want to be in a hall with each other at this point. They don't want to be in an enclosed space. Let's give some outdoor concerts that feature composers Hispanic and African American audiences have never had a chance to listen to. There are operas written by these people, for heaven's sake. There are, symphonies written by them, all sorts of things. So that was how their program, sort of flowered into existence. And they began doing it in a number of different locations. Patricio became a member of our board several years ago, and that's how we became connected to Patricio. So at a certain point, he suggested, why don't we do an Angelitos Negros performance with you doing a discovery portion, like you do a listening session, like you do, in your other concerts, like you do in all your concerts. So I said, fantastic, let's do it. And we decided that we would do it in Newark so that we could reach some audience that we never had a chance to reach before. And we would do it in a setting that I guess a lot of performances. Grace Church in Grace Episcopal Church in Newark on Broad
Sure.
Street. They have a lot of interesting things that happen there. So we thought it'd be a good place. And some of our audience will come. And of course, importantly, they will discover that there are these composers they never heard of before. And hopefully, in the process, find that they can be very moved by these composers, just as they are by their Brahms and Tchaikovsky and all the other people that they think they love so much.
Of course, of course. In the promo for this concert, there's a hint of an interactive aspect of the show. Is this going to be a surprise, or is there anything that you can share?
Well, no, that's the discovery process that I use. I will create a listening guide for the song that we're investigating. That's Ayunantilla. There's an Antilles in the Caribbean Sea is the song. And it's no one knows who wrote the melody. Patricio has arranged it for soloist and chorus. And so, they're going to, it takes 2 minutes to sing. So they're going to perform it. And then with a listening guide, I'm going to get the audience to do what Saul made all those kids do all those years, which is solve musical problems by listening to the next excerpt. So that's the interactive aspect of the program. It won't take the whole program. It will just take a portion of the program. And then after we take it apart, they'll sing it once again. And hopefully, like almost all the people who come to our concerts, it sounded so different the second time. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they noticed more.
Sure. Yeah, they were actually like listening.
They were listening, exactly. Right? They weren't looking at their cell phone and texting a friend in Montclair or something. I don't know.
I'm just so moved by the fact that for this upcoming concert, not only will there be discovery, engagement of new audiences, Saul's spirit is there. I mean,
it's on.
I think that's just so beautiful.
And he lived into his 90s. We lost him just last year. That was one of the biggest sadnesses of my life when Saul passed last year, because we stayed in contact my entire professional life. I mean, we'd get together, have lunch, especially when I moved up to the New York area. He was still in Philadelphia. We would meet in New Hope and have lunch on a regular basis. And of course, he was as concerned about the whole of life as he was about music, because he believed that if you learn to become a perceptive listener, you might become perceptive in other areas of your life.
Well, of course.
Like you might begin to notice things about other people that you thought were true that aren't really true, or that you, oh my heavens, wow, these people have something really to give to this situation, and you hadn't perceived that before because of things that you had been taught as a child.
Right.
And so he was always very concerned about the political climate of the country, about the racial tensions of the country, about the anti-Semitism of the country. I mean, Saul was Jewish. He'd seen a lot.
They can't be separated.
They cannot be set. If you become perceptive, you can't deny your awareness after a while. It's staring you right in the face. So how are you going to react to that? Are you going to become an activist in some areas? I mean, Saul went to jail when the public school teachers in Philadelphia went on strike. He actually spent a night in jail, because he was on the picket lines and they arrested a bunch of teachers. And Eric Michaels, my gosh, he had me on protests for racial equality and the Vietnam War in the 1960s, much to my parents' horror.
I'm sure.
But again, it's this awareness. It's becoming perceptive. And it's so important in everything of our lives.
So I'll be sure to have links for everyone to learn more about this concert, and hopefully they'll come out. But to sort of wrap us up here, this program, I think it goes without saying, stands against so much that's happening. Certainly recently, when it comes to people scaling back DEI and all those sorts of things. How do you see the Discovery Orchestra, or maybe I should ask, how should people think about the Discovery Orchestra in our context, considering that that you've always been doing this work. It's not new work. So is it a renewed sense of mission for you? How would you encourage people to think about this in context?
Oh, I do think it's a renewed sense of mission. I will say that a beautiful thing is that when we do have the orchestra out there to make a television show, which at this point takes about 2 years to raise the money to present that, to record that television show, we, first of all, there, even though we are an 802 orchestra, we have a contract filed with 802. There is no roster. There's no permanent roster. So I'm allowed to select with my personnel manager anyone I want to be in that orchestra. And if you ask the members of the Discovery Orchestra, they'll tell you it's the most diverse orchestra they play in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I want the people around the country who see this orchestra on television to see an orchestra that looks like the American population, for heaven's sake, you know? Yeah. In other words, it's not old European white men like the Philadelphia Orchestra was when I was a child. You know, it's this young, old, I mean, we have trans members, we have African-American members, we have Hispanic members. You know, it's a very diverse orchestra. Plus, we go out of our way to invite a diverse audience to be the television audience for these programs, so that when the camera's panning the audience, again, it doesn't look like the Academy of Music did when I was a child in Philadelphia, all these elderly white people. It's this mix of young and old and gay and straight and just, you know, and we have the ability to control that aspect of our little part of the world. So we're going to keep doing it with a renewed spirit, yes.
That's the tail end of Movement 3 from Dvorak's New World Symphony. So George Schulte led the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in that recording. As much as I go on about new music and living composers, I would say that Dvorak's Ninth Symphony is an important one to go back to, because it's Dvorak himself who said Black musical traditions here in the United States offer all that's needed to develop an American classical tradition. Did we listen? No, we didn't, but that's another conversation. Anyway, shout out to George Marriner Maull for joining me here and for offering his story. Be sure to check out their upcoming concert on the 23rd, and be sure to check out my chat with soprano Cheryl Warfield, who will be featured in the very next opus. It should be out, so just scroll on over to the next episode to hear from her. For now, though, I want to offer my two-part report in response to what's happening at the Kennedy Center. So if you don't know, President Trump appointed himself board chair of the Kennedy Center a week or so ago, and we're already seeing the impact of that decision. There have been lots of folks who have pulled their shows, and there have been others whose shows have been canceled straight away. Among those was a planned performance for Pride Month. One of the nation's gay men's choruses was scheduled to perform with the National Symphony, but now that's out. It doesn't fit the vision of the new board chair, apparently. You know, I personally didn't need to see anything canceled to form an opinion about what my engagement with this institution would be moving forward, but I don't think it's been important for me to, I do think rather it's important for me to name that I have collaborated with this venue many times, that this isn't an organization that I have zero connection to. I think the first time I performed at the Kennedy Center was with the Philharmonic Orchestra. Shout out to the Phantom and the Phoenix and all those musicians. That was a New Year's Eve gig, maybe 2017 or 2018, something like that. I can't quite remember, but it was lit. It was a good time. I've also spoken on decolonizing classical music there a few times in collaboration with Washington National Opera. Shout out to Jennifer Bowman, who put me on to those opportunities. And even way back when I was living in Knoxville, I was invited to facilitate a panel of change makers in the arts. I have a history there, all of that to say. I mention these things because from where I stand, this institution has a history of really exploring and challenging the norm. It's a key part of the artistic ecosystem here in the U.S., but now it's been taken over by politics. My personal opinion is that moving forward, we should not engage this place at all. It's officially become a space in which some people are welcome and others are not. I don't think it's right, much less fair or just, to fill a space based on privilege, whether that be the privilege of flying under the radar as a marginalized person or holding all of the identities and politics that this administration is looking to center. My feeling is that a boycott should be put in place. All artists with a heart of compassion should look for other venues, other partners, change your plans, because this space is no longer a positive contribution to broader narratives around art as a means of change. There are many people who hold the same opinion as I do, but there are many others who don't. So in the next opus, I'll dive more into what the other opinions are and what I think of them. But for now, I thought I'd just state my perspective and my truth. Any artist willfully engaging the Kennedy Center is a contributor to the right-wing takeover of the United States. That's just how I see it. Yes, I understand many people work there that need their jobs, but where do we draw the line? What does Donald Trump need to do or say for people to find financial alternatives? Does he need to bar all Black people for us to really consider the deep personal sacrifices that we have to make for the sake of justice? What if he went full Hitler and started building ovens on the front lawn of the concert hall? Would that be enough for people to walk away from their jobs? Let me know what you think. As I've said on social media, I'm more than willing to be wrong and more than willing to change my mind on how we should respond to this situation. But for now, I say full boycott, cancel the Kennedy Center and spend your dollars and your time elsewhere. When we turn a blind eye to injustice, the injustices that have already happened in conjunction with the takeover of this institution, justice will eventually turn a blind eye to us. I hope that we can all understand that this may not directly impact our artistry or our lives now, but it will if we allow this institution to continue to build the support, the public revenue and everything surrounding it that affirm what the new team wants to do there. That's how I feel about it. But again, like I said, let me know what you think. Thanks again for tuning in. More from me in the next opus. If you're so inclined, go ahead and check it out. It should be ready for you now already. But in the meantime, let's stay alert. Let's stay informed. And let's fight for what we believe in. That's certainly what I'm doing. And I hope that you can find the courage to do so as well. There's no sideline to stand on anymore. There's no neutrality. We are all going to be a part of this, or we are all going to be a part of the status quo that's changing the face of America forever. To freedom. Peace.